Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Facebook Live discussion, Financials Part 2, with a little added bonus from Streetworks to start off the evening. And I'm going to save all the introductions for who's joining us this evening and go right to, I just want to talk about what is actually happening this evening. So this was always intended to be a Facebook Live Part 2 to the financial discussion that we had in December. We'd received several follow-up questions since then, which we are going to hope to answer tonight. But first, we have asked Streetworks to kick it off because they are going to be doing an update to share with you some modifications that they've made on the One Westfield Place proposal since its introduction. And I look forward to hearing from them tonight. And I'm going to first let you know who's with us from Streetworks. And we have Doug Adams, who is the Senior Vice President of Development, Trinisa Dunusar, who's the Chief Communications Officer, and Carolina Simon, our Vice President of Development. Hopefully, for those of you that have been to the Preview Center, many of these are familiar faces to you. And we are looking forward to hearing from them this evening, and they're going to take you through a bit of the process that got to this point and share with you some of the modifications that they've been making that they're announcing this evening. So I think I'm handing it over to you, Doug.
Correct. Thank you, Mayor. We're very excited to present tonight. For me, when I work on an important project like this, it's an intense effort spread over many years. At Streetworks, that entails work that most developers do, but also intensive municipal and community outreach that most developers, frankly, do not undertake. It's been our philosophy almost for 40 years to listen, to learn, and refine our plan. It's an approach I find personally most rewarding. It does not mean that every concern results in a change or that every idea is incorporated into the project. We do bring our experience and our opinions to bear as well, but we really do try to listen. We will spend the next 20 to 30 minutes reviewing our outreach efforts that brought us here tonight and how that engagement has resulted in specific and meaningful changes and additions to our proposed plan. With that, I'll turn it over to Trinisa.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. It's great to be here with you. And as the mayor suggested, we may have had the pleasure of hosting many of you at the One Westfield Place Preview Center on Elm Street. I've personally very excited to be on the front line in the community and hear directly from each of you about your excitement, your concerns, and your modifications for our program. And tonight, we are going to dive into sharing a good list of things that we've heard from you that you'd like for us to modify. But let's first start with talking about how many people we've seen to date. We can get to the next slide. While we look at the 3 phases of our collaborative milestones, you'll all be familiar with the master plan reexamination that happened, the Streetworks designation in 2020. And what we're very proud of is the listening tour that we were able to conduct during a time that was very difficult for all of us during the pandemic. What we found that we had a very captive audience of interested community leaders and residents that wanted to be heard, and we were able to take advantage of our favorite tool, Zoom, to listen in and capture your feedback and reactions to our development proposal. Very soon thereafter, we were able to open up our physical representation of the development at our Preview Center in October. And here we are today as we're getting ready to share all of the culmination of your feedback and how it's impacted our proposal. What does that mean, culmination? Well, it means thousands and thousands of people who care about the town of Westfield, who wanted to give their point of view on what we were proposing, from 74 stakeholders tours to 1,200 people visiting the Preview Center, to many specialized sessions that were talking about specific subject matters that were important to you and that we'd already captured were concerns and opportunities for us to evolve the plan. But 6,600 people that we've engaged with, from being in the preview center to hosting various events in the community to talking to you, even as we met with you at the Sounds of Westfield events and the pizza run. All of those comments have been factored in and are represented here in this total number of engagements with community members. Let's give you a little sample of what all that means. From the special topic presentations that we were able to conduct, you may remember that we've used Facebook Live in the past to talk about the impact on public spaces, the changing consumer behaviors about how we shop today and the impact on retail, the future of working in the office, that is very much a part of our proposal. From financial information sessions, of course, the important traffic mitigation sessions, and some upcoming sessions such as our wellness and sustainability. We've had 16 of those. We've also been able to tailor our presentation to engage various neighborhoods from Ward 3 to Ward 4. At this point, we've been able to tell each of those communities what our project means to them, but more importantly, we've been able to hear back from the community what the development means to them. And as we talked about the preview center, there was a time during the 2020 when we were able to host meetings very much like this, where we were able to engage specific groups like the YMCA, the sports league leaders, various local media representatives were very much interested in this and sharing the evolution and the progress that we have with this proposal. Civic leaders, faith leader groups, even groups like the downtown business owners, which is very important for us to hear from them and their thoughts on how our proposal will impact their downtown. And after we've opened up the preview center on Elm Street, we've been able to talk to a sample of 50 plus groups, such as the local mothers of Westfield, New Jersey, and Friends of Brightwood Park, and new residents groups, and sports leagues, parents associations. And of course, importantly, we're able to talk to representatives of the realty industry, as they have great interest in how this development would affect their ability to spotlight what makes Westfield so attractive if you're looking to buy or looking to bring a business into the community. We're really happy that we've had 1,200 people, more than that, since we've even made this slide, because we've been open. We've been keeping business hours to host each of you, and we'll continue to keep the preview center open to welcome each of you so that you can stand over that very large model of the town. It's great to see people delight over having that bird's eye view of the town. And I've often found people be very disappointed that their neighborhood or their house didn't make the cut on the model. We're sorry, we apologize in advance. But the real reason for showing such a vast portion of the downtown was so that you could see that we're celebrating, not changing what's already there and celebrated for Westfield, but also concentrate where we are on the mass transit line and on the Lord and Taylor site, so that you can put things in perspective and understand that we want to contribute to the Westfield community. We're excited about our proposal, but so much of the community will remain untouched. And we thank you. So please, if you haven't had an opportunity to come to One Westfield Place, we'll be there tomorrow. Come and see us. We'll be there on Saturday. Come and see us. But we're happy that we've been able to have such an opportunity to welcome in so many members of the community. So with that, I'll turn it over to Carolina, who will get into the specifics of how we've evolved our project.
Thank you, Theresa. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I will, through the subsequent slides, I will walk you through some of those changes that came as a direct result of your comments and feedback to us, whether they came virtually, in writing, or in person. And several people have asked us, how are you aggregating all of those comments and how do you keep track of them? Well, it's not a small undertaking, but I can tell you that our team meets every week on a weekly basis. And we basically aggregate our comments and feedbacks that we hear into four main categories. The first one is in program and massing. Program and massing has to do with scale, height, density, setbacks, land use, meaning the uses of the buildings, etc. Then we focused on and aggregate comments around public spaces, so public realm. So folks say, well, I would love that we are able to host a yoga session in the town green. That would be an example of a public realm related comment. Parking is parking. We all know it, pretty straightforward. We aggregate all issues related to parking, whether it be on the commuter parking side or private parking side. We aggregate all of those comments into a parking category. And then traffic. Traffic, there's no qualms about it. Traffic has been at the forefront of concerns we have over the 4 years, and post presence of the preview center, we continue to hear concerns regarding parking. And I hope that you have been able to access our sessions for traffic, as well as our traffic report. Moving on, Jim, if you don't mind going to the next slide. So what I will walk you through now is the highlight, and I will focus on the changes that were a direct result of your comments and feedback to us since we've been in the preview center. We have been in the preview center, to give folks an idea, since the end of September of 2022. So it's been several months of aggregation of comments coming from the preview center. So the image that you see here is the lot on the corner of North and Clark. And that lot today, to give you the reference, is a surface parking lot. It's owned by HBC Streetworks. It used to be the lot where the former Lord & Taylor employees would park when the store was open. So the first bucket here is that, and the first concern that we've heard over and over and over again, is that that area is very congested, and folks were concerned about height and density as well as traffic. So we've heard you, we've aggregated all of those issues and concerns, and here is what we are implementing as a direct result of your feedback. Our proposal before this change contemplated a multifamily apartment open to all ages, with a total of 34 units. And given your feedback, we went ahead and implemented a change that basically shifts and converts that to 16 townhomes. So that reduces the number of units by about 18, and also decreases the height of that location. The second main concern that we've heard in this area was the traffic. Traffic backs up. There are issues with drop off and pick up of folks on the corner of Ferris and Clark, and then on the corner of North and Clark. And if you're coming southbound from Clark, it's pretty congested today without any effort or mitigation. So from a traffic perspective, so that's in the traffic bucket, if you remember our 4 categories, we are going to add a traffic signal and mitigate with safety as well as traffic flow with pedestrian crossings. We're going to really reshape that intersection to allow traffic to flow better with the new traffic signal, as well as increase pedestrian safety. We are also going to be in this location instituting and creating a dog park. This dog park will be privately funded by us, as well as privately managed, but publicly accessible. So if you have a dog, you do not need to live in one of our buildings. You can come in and enjoy with others, hopefully. And if you don't have a dog, but you like dogs, I think you're also welcome to sit down on the bench and enjoy the dogs. We're also introducing, what we're really excited about, a community garden. And we hope to be shaping the program and the actual area, meaning the size of this community garden, with you throughout the subsequent months. And again, this community garden will be privately funded by us, privately managed, but also publicly accessible. So we're very excited. And again, we're very appreciative because none of these changes would have been possible without your feedback. So thank you for that. If we go to the next slide and moving on. So now we were on the corner of North and Clark. Now we're on the south side of the train station. On the left mid image, you can see the train station on the left side of that image. So we're on the south side of the train station. This, I would say, is also all of these changes that are highlighted here have been a result of your direct feedback since we've opened and been in the preview center together with you. And this falls into the category of programming and massing, right? A lot of folks were concerned about the height of the office buildings. And as a direct result of your feedback, we are proposing and we'll go ahead and we have removed one full floor across the two office buildings. And exactly, thank you, Jim, those areas, exactly. So those areas will no longer exist moving forward, which brings our building from a total of 5 stories to 4 stories if you're looking at it along South Ave. That was very important for the residents, not only the residents that are on the south side, but also the residents as a whole. And it was a comment that came and a concern that came through quite often in the preview center. One other input that came from business community as well as residents along South Avenue was the comments that South Avenue was very unsafe as a street to cross from a north-south direction. And there were all sorts of issues associated with turns of lefts and flow along this stretch of South Avenue. So we are proposing the creation, given your feedback, of 16 on-street parking spaces along South Avenue. I have to say here too and highlight that those spaces will be devoted to the retails that are along South Avenue, but the retail for within our buildings are going to be parked within our buildings. I have to remind everybody too that the spaces that are within the parking structure for the office will be open to the public after hours as well as on the weekends. So you will have a tremendous surplus of parking spaces available to you after hours and during the weekends, and that's over 500 spaces. That's net new that will be available to you. Continue on our changes, we have gone ahead and upgraded the pedestrian crosswalks. This is the underpass as well as the pedestrian crosswalks along South Avenue. And that is in direct combination with the traffic mitigation improvements that we have implemented as a part of this proposal along South Avenue. If we can go
Carolina,
to the next.
can you elaborate? Can you just elaborate on that a little bit about what does that mean to approve the pedestrian crosswalks? Is it through signals or striping, or what does that mean?
It is through all of the above. So it is through the incorporation of traffic signals. The first item here on this slide is a direct result of feedback post opening of the preview center. We will go ahead and add adaptive traffic signals. In addition to the instituting new traffic signals at certain intersections, we're also going to go ahead and implement adaptive signals. Adaptive signals, to explain in a non-technical way, is a signal that through a camera can detect the flow and how many vehicles and can adjust the timings. And that makes the signal much more dynamic and intelligent and much able to adapt to the traffic flows and the number of vehicles that are going through that signal. In addition, in terms of pedestrian safety, we are reshaping the corners of all of those intersections. So Boulevard and South, Prospect, etc. And we are reshaping those Central and South Avenue. We're reshaping those corners so the distance for actually crossing is shorter, and it's much more comfortable and safe, most importantly, safe for pedestrians to cross. We are providing, as a direct result of your comments, we're providing bike paths along the train lines, and those are coming from the train station westbound, connecting to the area where the memorial is today. And we're also connecting under the railways and introducing a new bike path in that area. And that, again, is in direct relation to the comments that came through during the preview center. One minor comment, I have to say that this comment did not take the same level of a degree as, let's say, the corner of North and Clark from a number of folks that have highlighted this. But we went ahead, because there were quite a few comments, not as much, but quite a few. We went ahead and introduced a new drop-off for ride sharing and drop-off of folks that is eastbound of the south side of the train station. So north of our office building, that today there is an access to the train platform in that location. So now folks will have two options to drop off and pick up folks. They will have one that is immediately below or adjacent to the south side of the train station, and they will have one that is further east where the existing ramp and stair is today. Jim, next slide, please. So I so far focused on the comments and changes that we are making as a direct result of your comments post preview center. But I do want to emphasize that the comments that you see here on the screen, or the changes rather, excuse me, that you see here on the screen, there are over 25 changes, and those changes have been incorporated for over 3 years, almost 4 years of active engagement within your community, like Trinisa has highlighted in previous slides. And I use this very simplistic analogy that I think is a way to comprehend, in a way that I can comprehend, which is all of these changes are triangulated. So if you have your living room and you decide to move your couch to another area or the other side, chances are you have to move lamps, you have to move the other chairs, the rug has to rotate, the coffee table has to rotate potentially. And so it's no different here. Every comment that you've given us, we have taken a look at it, we have validated, we have understood its impact on the rest of our proposal here that you see today. And we are very lucky and we're very happy to have been able to implement them today to you. So just walking through this and going over to it again, I will go counterclockwise and start with the conversion of the townhomes on the top left of the page. And so we went through that. That's in the corner of North and Clark. You can see that the building as it exists today, meaning as it exists not in our proposal today, we will be converting that building into 16 units of townhomes. That's not to mistake with the 16 units of townhomes that we already proposed, and they will remain across the street from our Lord and Taylor building, where you see Jim pointing it out. We'll go through and have instituted, as a result of your feedback, the new traffic signal and traffic improvements, pedestrian crossings, etc., on the corner of North and Clark. We have widened the sidewalks, including setbacks associated with the datums of building heights, as well as how far our buildings sit from the street. So that's just to represent that little icon. We have implemented and turned the townhomes. We've heard that there was a great need for that type of product in Westfield. And so we've converted the townhomes that were open to everybody to be age restricted. As I mentioned, we have the new dog run. That dog run is going to be located right in that area, which is west of the last townhome, across the street from our Lord and Taylor site. And we have maintained and introduced setbacks as our buildings are taller than the 40 feet datum that we can find throughout Westfield. So that was very important from a pedestrian perspective. You will not be able to see that buildings are a little taller because they really stand back away from the street and away from your view as a pedestrian going by them. As a reminder, we have evolved our plans, and our 138 units here across the two buildings that we have flanking each side of the Lord and Taylor building are age restricted. We went ahead, and instead of demolishing the Lord and Taylor building, which we understood, and we've heard so many stories of folks that have memories for that iconic store and its role in Westfield, instead of demolishing the building, instead of demolishing the building, we went ahead and maintained the building. And so we are adaptively reusing that structure that is not only does not only give us the opportunity to maintain that historic structure, but also the opportunity to be very environmentally conscious in not having to build a new building. The community garden, as I mentioned, will be in the area where the new townhomes will be, the 16 units, and we're very excited to engage with you on programming that actual area together. We are going, you see there a pedestrian bridge. Several of you throughout our tenure in the preview center have come through and pointed out the difficulties of crossing along that area. And we completely get it. We also have difficulties in crossing in that area. And we are going to look at designing and implementing a pedestrian bridge. All out here for folks, the pedestrian bridge is not going to go over the tracks. The pedestrian bridge is going to be north of the tracks, running parallel to the tracks. And someone asked me the other day at the preview center, how will you get that approved? Well, we have to work together with NJ Transit, and we will do that as we do for all of our other projects, including this one. This one is no different from that perspective. And we work very closely with them and everybody else, including the town and the community, to establish and make that dream possible. But that, again, I want to thank again, there were quite a few folks that came through and suggested that. We had not thought about that, and that is really, truly to your own credit. One thing that happened as we went through the evolution of our plans and several options that we've generated, we actually, in the beginning, believe it or not, we had one single commuter parking garage. And through conversations with several community groups, including the town, and I have to say, your council works really hard because we constantly get feedback from you through them, through this process. And the town has uncovered, and in this discovery process of where people were coming from, et cetera, and there is a very even split between the north and the south in terms of where folks are coming from as they access commuter parking. So we went ahead and modified our plans, and we proposed 2 separate commuter parking garage structures, which are the ones that Jim is pointing out to you on the screen. Very important, this came through also the new left turn signal infrastructure. We have quite a few along South Avenue. This is a direct response for folks that constantly complain about that area. The programming and plans for the town square and the town green, for those that have come to the preview center, you've heard us talk about Dan Biederman. We have engaged purposely through direct comments from you, Dan Biederman, and he has been working with us closely with town and the DWC to really program appropriately those 2 squares. One question to clarify here, because I've heard this quite a few times. We are maintaining the vehicular access to and from the train station, but we are beautifying and reprogramming those two spaces, and that is in the category of public realm comments and feedback that we got from you. And so I want to clarify that. I've heard the misnomer quite a few times, and we are maintaining vehicular access. So you will be able to drop off your spouse or friend. We're not eliminating that whatsoever. We talked about the 16 new on-street parking spaces along South Avenue. We talked about the fact that we not only eliminated the the topmost floor of the two office buildings, but we're also split the building into two. Initially, we had contemplated for this building to be one. We've gotten a lot of concerned feedbacks on the sheer size and scale of the building. So we went ahead and introduced that pedestrian boulevard, which is basically the continuation of boulevard, to allow pedestrian access straight to that platform or that ramp that takes you to the platform that I mentioned before. We've increased the setbacks and also set the office in, so the datum of retail along that frontage mirrors the height of the retail on the south side of South Avenue. We talked about the both office floors being removed. From your feedback, also, folks were concerned about being protected during rains or inclement weather. So we've introduced along the north side of the train tracks a covered walkway. And so that takes you from the commuter parking garage westbound along the north side of the train tracks. We've reduced the size of and the overall height of the north garage. This is something that happened along 2022, but it was preview center opening. And we've also maintained, as I mentioned before, and we're very mindful of maintaining that datum height of 40 feet and then setting the building back. Here, as you can see, oops, Jim, you're too excited. As you can see, if we can go to a super important, nevertheless, I don't know if folks remembered when we were first designated as the redeveloper here, we also had been designated for Lot 7. Since then, the town had asked us to reduce our scope, and we went ahead and that Lot 7 was removed from the current scope and proposals that you see here today. So we will not be developing or providing a proposal for that lot. If we go to the next slide. So this, folks, really
Carolina?
just, yes.
I'm sorry, just go back for a second because you skipped a couple of things.
Oh,
before
have
you
I?
got all the way in the circle. Quimby.
Oh,
and-
I stopped on Lot 7. Thank you. Thank you,
sure.
Linda. Thank you. The counter clock threw me off. So Quimby Street. Quimby Street is truly a direct result of many, many months of several conversations with you. To clarify again, we've had some misnomers on this. Quimby Street will remain a vehicular street as it is today. This is just really just beautifying it, making sure that the street furniture and the streetscape elements are there and they're available for the town and your community to be able to close at times that you find that you would like to celebrate or for special occasions. We are improving. We've heard so many conversations and so many comments and concerns about the state of affairs, if you will, of the underpass, that goes under the rail from a safety perspective, as well as its level of lighting, etc. So we will be producing aesthetic improvements on that underpass. We've reconfigured the town square. The town square was a little different as we evolved our plans, and through your comments, like we need places to sit, we need the retails to have the ability to to serve their customers within these zones. We need a place for, and we need to preserve the Christmas tree. So all of those comments combined allowed us to evolve the plan, and we will continue to do so for the town square. And last but not least, I did speak about previously about the improved bike paths. Those are the 2 bike paths that link the train station to that area of the memorial. And as I mentioned, we under the rail, we are introducing a new bike lane. That lane does not eliminate the vehicular lanes that are already there. There is actually enough space for a bike path as well as a sidewalk, because there is a little bit of a shoulder there today. So we were able to take advantage of those dimensions and provide those 2 elements in a very comfortable and safe way for folks. So I think that does it, right, Linda? I think that was
covered.
it.
Yes,
I hope
thank
I
you.
didn't miss anything. So this is just a list. For some folks are more visual, some folks like to read. And so this is just the same information organized in a different way. As I mentioned, the 4 buckets of aggregated comments and feedback that we've gotten from you. There were hundreds of comments that came through. We keep them and we map them and we track them very closely, including our responses to you, whether it be in writing or a follow-up call or a meeting in the preview center like we have been doing, and we will continue to do so. So this matrix here, oops.
Go ahead, Carolina.
So just to wrap up on this matrix, you'll see the top part of it just highlights the evolution of our process and the changes that we've heard throughout since our inception, which has been over several years, almost 4. And then the bottom part highlights the changes that we have incorporated as a direct result of our presence in the preview center. I do have to say, though, that a lot of the comments that are on the top part of this chart were also voiced in the preview center. But the beauty of it is that we are able to point out to folks in real time their concerns. But we thought, for sake of simplicity as well as transparency, we did not want to classify those comments as post-preview center because we had addressed them pre-preview center. So with that,
Carolina, actually, before you move on, I do think I just want to highlight, because I think this is really important. I also want everybody to know that these slides will be all posted tomorrow. So if you want to spend time and read through, you'll have plenty of time to do that. But, you know, there's many people that have said that this proposal was, you know, I think done in a vacuum and presented to the public. And I think it's really important to your comments about how much input you had already gotten from the many listening to sessions you had, as well as the council. And I can only tell you from our perspective, the things that we fought, and fought is the right word in many cases in terms of the proposal, like eliminating lot 7 as a proposed development area was a big deal. I mean, you were designated to do all 4, and we said no, it's not going to happen. Let's see how the rest nets out. The 55 plus was a really big deal, because I know that's never your first preference, but that was really important for us, that we could mitigate not school impact, but also know that there was a need for that in the community. We fought hard for office space because we know it was really all driven about our benefits and trying to drive foot traffic to our downtown. And that was really important. And quite frankly, I think it's become even a greater opportunity in Westfield post-COVID. I think the adaptive reuse of the Lord and Taylor, I know originally it was a plan for you guys to tear that building down. And we've, you know, kept advocating for ways to keep it. And not only because I think the attachment to the building and how we used to, we're seeing, but also just the sustainability aspect of preserving a building as opposed to tearing it down. And also you brought up, but I think splitting the parking garages was a big deal as well. Like, I know everything was originally focused on South Avenue. And I think we all agree that putting it in 2 different locations is the right answer for lots of good reasons. But I just wanted everybody to know that even prior to the introduction, there was a lot of advocacy that went on prior to that, not only from the council because of feedback we had gotten from the public, but also from the folks that you had, part of your listening tour. Linda, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I think the only thing that I would emphasize in addition to the comments you made, Mayor, is just the very clear attention that Streetworks has made to all the public safety and, the expansion of the efforts to improve the pedestrian experience and the, safety in crossings, because there's a lot of intersections that are going to be improved, which will improve traffic flows and congestion, as well as improve safety.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mayor. So Doug, I will pass it on to you so we can wrap up. And thank you again, everyone. And please continue to come to the Preview Center.
Thanks, Carolina. Yeah, just briefly, and I do think highlighting 3 changes that frankly were a challenge for us to make, but we're done so in large part because of the concentration of comments from the community. And moving from the apartment building to the townhomes, dropping a full story in the South office, which is something I've heard quite regularly myself while there, and adding adaptive signalization along the 2 key avenues and key intersections, I think are things that we heard loud and clear from the community, and they were difficult for us to make. But I was also pleased that the changes were distributed both by the type of impact they addressed, but also the geography. There's literally, as I think you saw, and people please go back and study it, the balance between traffic and pedestrian space safety is very important. But the overall, there was not a part or a place of the project that was left untouched. And we're pleased that we were able to come back. And again, at our heart, it can be a difficult process at times, but to us, we find it yields a better plan in the end. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Mayor, and thank you very much for the time tonight, both the people on Facebook, but allowing us this platform.
Thank you, Doug, Teresa, and Carolina. I just want to let everybody know that so what the next steps for that. So Streetworks and our finance team will be making a formal presentation to the council next week at the council meeting, and that's for the council to ask questions and get updates. And then on January 19th, I don't know if you hear my dogs in the background. 2 days later, we'll be doing a Facebook Live with Streetworks and our town planning professionals to review the planning and design. So there can be more detailed conversations about what you heard tonight and any additional questions that you might receive and we might receive. And if you do have any questions, first and foremost, go to the Preview Center. I have found that the Preview Center has been really a great place to dispel a lot of misconceptions. When I've been in there, I've had people walk in, they thought the entire town was being redeveloped and were pleasantly surprised to see it's just along the train line. So it really is important and great context for people to go. So first and foremost, go visit the Preview Center. You can ask some questions specifically to the Streetworks professional themselves, or you can ask questions at the one-westfield-place.com website, or in advance of our Facebook Live on January 19th, you can ask them at this address here. And again, all of this information and deck and slides will be posted tomorrow. So with that, we're going to let Doug and Teresa and Carolina go, and we are going to be moving to part 2, finance. There's really, I don't think, any pretty pictures in the rest of the presentation. So sorry about that, but I do want to just remind everybody, so we had that detailed Facebook Live with our finance professionals in December 19th, I think it was. The purpose of tonight is not to recap or just go over all the information that we've gotten before. I think they'll provide you with some context, but primarily it is going to respond to some of the questions that we've received. And what you just saw, obviously, from Streetworks is kind of, the concepts and the renderings and so forth. And I think it's really important to remind ourselves, remember, there is no such thing as a perfect project. And I think that's what the community right now is gauging. There is no perfect project. It doesn't exist. You have to evaluate rewards and drawbacks, and there is in every single thing. And I think what you're going to see in the finance presentation is really kind of putting the meat around so many of the benefits to our community that will touch every single aspect of in a positive way of how we'll be able to operate and sustain ourselves and really future-proof Westfield for decades to come. And that's what really I'm hoping that, you know, our community will be open-minded in making that assessment, and that you're going to hear more about those benefits tonight. So I'm not going to have everybody introduce themselves for the sake of time, but just want to let you know who is joining us tonight. Bob Powell, who has been our finance professional. He's a redevelopment finance expert. He is here. He's going to be talking about the financial and the pilot. Steve Milenick is our redevelopment legal counsel from Greenball Law. Matt Jessup, he's a partner at Manneman Scott. He's our bond counsel, and I'm sorry, Matt, I can't resist. He's a born and raised Westfield Ward 4 resident, and so happy to have that local perspective joining our really incredible finance team. And then, of course, I can't say enough about our finance committee chair, Councilman Linda Hapgood, who has been incredibly involved and brings the balance of her own financial professional expertise, as well as, you know, what she hears day in and day out from constituents. So that's been great. So the entire finance committee has been involved: Mark Parmley, David Contract, Scott Katz, and then our economic development consultant, Liz Jeffrey, and our town attorney, Tom Jardine. Now, but joining us tonight, we've got Bob, Steve, Matt, Linda, and now Jim Gilday is joining us tonight because he's going to be adding some additional context in terms of some of the questions that we received. So I'm not going to go into this. I just want to give you an example if we move on, Jim. So we just want to show you some of the sample questions that we received, and many of these are these folks are going to try to answer in what you're going to see, and hopefully we can address maybe ones that if we feel like they weren't addressed afterwards. But just you know, a lot came out by what happens if Streetworks goes bankrupt. That seems to be one that a lot of people asked. You know, what are there contingencies in place to limit what can be built on these parcels? You know, what prevents Streetworks from getting their tax abatement on Lord and Taylor and then canceling it? Why can't we just lease the land to Streetworks instead of actually selling it to them? Can they sell the land? What will happen with the delay in pilot money? Does it depend on occupancy and financial restitution? And then, very importantly, and these are save the best for last, how will the project reduce taxes for Westfield residents, and when? Will this project increase costs for town services, and how will that impact our taxes? And who pays for the maintenance on the parking garage and green space, and how will that impact our property taxes? So there is a theme here. And the one thing I think that everybody, number one priority and concern for everybody is property taxes. And it's something that everybody and every single resident cares about. And there's nobody better equipped to discuss property taxes, municipal financing than Jim Gilday. So our long-term town administrator, hopefully all of you know, he's been through about 20 municipal budget cycles, seen the best and the worst, and we're incredibly lucky to have one of the best town administrators in the state. And that I hear that from every mayor I talk to, so that's just not hyperbole. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Jim to take us through the municipal side of things related to this project.
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, I've done 20 municipal budgets here for Westfield, and I appreciate your comments. Also a 44-year resident of Westfield. Again, very invested in the community besides just working here. So I think my role tonight, I wanted to give a little perspective on a few things from my role as managing the town's budget, preparing, formulating, managing, and implementing 20 plus years budgets in the town of Westfield for the town. So a couple of things to mention. This slide here, obviously, just overview of how does this proposal benefit the town of Westfield and its residents particularly. So we're going to hear a lot more tonight from the other financial experts about the pilot. We heard some in the last presentation. We'll hear more tonight why a pilot is a positive thing, why we need one, why it's appropriate. So I won't get into all the details of those things, but you'll hear a lot more about that. But important thing to note is The pilot, from my perspective as a town administrator, from a budget management perspective, provides unprecedented revenue that we're going to actually have coming in over a 30-year period to do things like stabilizing property taxes or reducing them, obviously, depending on what the council at the time wants to do. Rebalancing the tax burden between commercial and residential taxes. I'll get more into this a little bit about population over the past few decades and how this project's actually increasing a lot more employee base versus residential base. I'll talk more about it in a few minutes. This kind of revenue provides an opportunity for us to maintain exceptional municipal services. And we'll talk more about that as well, but we'll hear more about the pilot later as well, about we're reserving part of the pilot money to make sure we have money set aside for things like enhancing services where we need to, or other discretionary things that council can do. And the significant public improvements that this project provides, which a regular annual municipal budget really cannot provide. And if it was to provide it, the taxpayers would be paying directly for those things. And we'll talk more about that as well. So again, significant investment of this type is going to improve property values in town and stabilize taxes in the long run. But this proposal overall presents a private capital investment in this town from Streetworks of over $375 million. Let me just say that one more time. $375 million. That's from I talked to colleagues all over the state of New Jersey, and there's development going on all over the state, as you all probably know. This particular project is really unprecedented when it comes to the numbers of the dollars being spent in one community. So I don't know, Mayor, if you have anything else to share on this slide. I know that you and I talked about maybe having a few comments, but I think that's just a quick overview. Anything else, Mayor?
No, I think you captured it. I think that's exactly right.
Okay, so one of the things, again, in my role is how does it impact our annual budget? And again, as a reminder to the residents, we are a calendar year budget town. So we just approved 2 weeks ago, the town council approved a temporary budget for 2023, and we'll be working on with Linda Habgood and her committee over the next 2 months on our budget for 23, which will take us to the end of the year. So we commissioned a report, which we'll hear about in a few minutes, by Richard Redding, who's an expert in the field of assessing impact on municipal budgets from projects like this. So a couple high-level points that come out of his report. And by the way, the report that I'm referencing will be made public on our website tomorrow. In addition to that, the information we just heard from Streetworks will actually reduce some of the residential component here and impact, because they've actually agreed to reduce some of the residential component we talked about on the north and Clark. So these numbers might be a slight bit higher than what we talked about on the residential side. But to give you a few bullet points quickly, Westfield represents 5.5% of the county's population, and yet we're only 3.61% of the county's employment base. So we'll get back to that in a second. Proposed project would generate significantly more jobs than residents. I mentioned that before. That's important. We've lost over 2,700 jobs, over 2,000 jobs in the past almost 6-7 years. And that's important. I'll explain why in a minute with some graphs. This project overall estimated to add 1,350 jobs, both retail and office. And 154 age-restricted units are expected to be occupied by 187 people. And the 69 age-restricted housing units were occupied by 161. So a total projected number of new residents over the course of the building of this project to full occupancy of 348 residents. And I'll go into a little detail of what kind of impact that will have on us. So this particular slide is a little a review of census data since 1970 to today. And again, the $2,700 number I was talking about was residential. So you see in 1970, our total population here in town was 33,700 people and change. We dropped off quite a bit in the 80s, 90s, and it slowly creeped back up since 2000. And we are actually, I think, in the latest census data, one of the slowest growing towns in the county, particularly in this last 10-year period. So this particular bar here is the census data from 2020, 31,032 people. With this new project, if it was at full capacity, which doesn't happen overnight, of course, but at full capacity, adding 300 at this time, 348 residents, which will be a little bit less based upon what Streetworks told us tonight, but 348 new residents, we slightly tick up to 31,380 people. So again, not a big increase. One thing I think I should note here, looking at the historic reduction and slow creep up, we've been actually averaging every decade 720 new residents to the town of Westfield, past 3 decades. So if we actually did that, in addition to the Streetworks number, by 2030, that would add a total of 1,068 residents by 2030, still putting us 1,600 residents less than the population in 1970. So that's significant because basically the infrastructure we have in place since 1970, the municipal services we provided them in 1970 to a much larger place. So good news is, even if the trend stayed the same over the past 3 decades with new residents, and we added this full amount of residents from this project, it still wouldn't even, we take it probably 2 more decades at the same growth to even come close to 1970s numbers. So important that I've heard some things, I live in town, and of course I hear things at parties and gatherings and block parties. This is not going to add a significant amount of people as projected by this report we went through, that the town cannot handle and manage services. So that's just an important point for everyone to understand on the population front. On the employee front, much shorter time frame proposed here because you had a big loss of employees in a much shorter time frame. You see here, we've lost over 2,000 private sector jobs since 2015. And again, basically a couple things to mention there. Some of the largest pieces of the puzzle when it comes to job loss, Lord & Taylor, most recently, a lot of jobs there. We had a large law firm, Lerner David, which was in town, which is actually occupied, not all, but a big part of the building that's right behind the Lord & Taylor building on the South Avenue side. And of course, one of their large consulting firm, Barrasso Consulting, which was bought by Deloitte & Touche, which also basically actually lost hundreds of employees, which occupied a lot of second floor offices in town. So we've had some significant losses in the past few years. So this particular project, if fully occupied, when fully occupied, 1,350 new employees proposed, both retail and office space, and still we would be below where we were in 2015. And the significance
Hey,
about,
Jim,
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to reiterate on their examples. Lerner David left because they wanted more modern office space with parking for at least 150 employees. And I met with them and we didn't have it. And the Deloitte moved because they didn't have adequate parking for their employees in our downtown. So,
yeah. And then the one important thing from a downtown perspective, and being a former member of the Downtown West Corporation for 10 plus years and being a resident in town, we need what was always referred to as the walking wallets. This office workers, people that left, we lost the lunch crowd, we lost the the gift crowd and so forth on a regular basis. So we want to infuse this. This goes back to supporting the downtown, having people working in the downtown and be able to walk downtown for various services, including lunch, etc. So this is not insignificant. And again, even though this project obviously will be a much larger employee addition than it will be residential, that's obviously something we're looking forward to putting back to make sure the downtown can survive. So a couple other things on this from this report. So in the report, what they call the tax supported marginal cost approach was used in the Reading report. And no town operates the same. We all have to fill out the same budget forms. We're a calendar town, there's fiscal year towns, but no town operates the same. And some towns do a better job than others on being efficient, on having good infrastructure. In our case, I'll take, obviously a lot, I'm biased because I've always worked here, but we're a AAA bond rated town. We operate very efficiently. And so we're in a very good spot to be able to operate very efficiently, when it comes to added employees and or residents. So in this case, the methodology that was used in the report produces a budget impact of $196,000, almost $197,000 for the residential component. I'll get into some details of that in a minute. And the non-residential component, office and retail, about $180,000, $181,000 increase on the impact in the budget. So the good news about this is the total impact is about $377,000 as per this report. That is a very easily managed number, but the more important point from my perspective as the administrator, that doesn't happen all at one time. I don't have to absorb that. If that was the actual number, I don't have to absorb that in any one budget. That happens over potentially multiple years. And once you build it into the budget, while it stays there potentially, you then don't have to raise it on every separate year. So again, and one last thing about this, well, on this topic, and you'll hear more about this later in the presentation, the pilot money that's coming in that we're using to offset all the costs here, we're reserving 20% of that aside for things just like this and other things as well. So, in this case, we're anticipating, obviously, there's some impact to the municipal budget. Some of the money left over or reserved, 20% of the pilot reserve can offset that. So again, we're protecting the taxpayers from a tax increase, and we can absorb those. And the pilot reserve is used for many other things as well. But again, this number is not a big number compared to our budget. And the next slide kind of talks about that a little bit. So just to give me.
Hey, Jim, before you move, can you just impacted costs would be comprised of?
I'm sorry, Mayor, you cut out there for a second.
What are the actual costs what are we paying for that would be impacted by the increase? Is it police, fire, other services?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was going to mention that here. So in the report, in the Reading report, they do a high level analysis of the parts of the budget that would be impacted. As you might expect, they anticipate things like public safety, health services, court services, other, things like that to be affected. I will say that's important to note that we're not going to have to go out and hire, 15 new police officers, 20 new firemen, 20 new public works people. As a matter of fact, our level of service today is actually very close to what we would need actually to serve this population. But public safety is one of the big components of police and fire. Public works, you might think would be a component from an employee perspective, but actually not really. With this proposal, while we'll have to maintain some new spaces, we're also going to be probably actually not maintaining other areas that when the development comes to completion, the owner of the property, obviously Streetworks, HBC, would be maintaining their own property. So we would lose some maintenance responsibilities that we have in certain areas. So that is actually rather much a wash. But, I think of public health services, for example. We know that obviously during the pandemic, our health department actually needed to provide health service to residential employees. But because the residential impact of this particular project is so much less than the employee impact, the residential impact is something that's much easier to manage from our daily operations annually versus the employee population, which is really a weekly daytime population versus nights and weekends. So again, just on this slide here, our 2022 municipal budget, actual budget, total amount 49.2 million. This particular, in the Reading report, they specify the impact of the total project, both residential and office, to be almost $378,000, which is before the changes we just heard about with Streetworks. So that'd be a little bit less, I'm sure. But even then, this represents less than 1% of our total budget in 2022. And of course, unfortunately, budgets do grow in the future, but this is easily absorbed by the anticipated infusion of pilot revenues. And that doesn't even talk about how well the town might do on its own, separate from pilot revenues going forward with surplus generation, other revenues from other departments, et cetera. So I feel very, very confident as the administrator here for 20 plus years and working for the town for 30 years that the projections and the estimated impact in the Reading report are very manageable. And the fact that they won't happen all at one time makes it even easier to manage going forward. And I think we're going to be in very good shape. And again, I have talked to our police chief and fire chief about this. They're very, very comfortable with this as well as we move forward. Of course, things have to evolve and we'll see what happens with the changes Streetworks made. But I think we're in a very good position. And again, just to reiterate, the report that I'm referencing will be made public tomorrow. Be posted on the website to people to review. There'll be some analysis in there. And but I think we're in very good shape. Any other questions, Mayor? Any other thoughts?
All right, thank you, Jim. I think we're good. So I think we're moving on to, I think Steve Winnick, is that right?
Yes.
That's right, Mayor.
So, all right, well, Steve, our redevelopment council, take it away.
Sure. Well, thank you, Mayor. And I guess just to reiterate, because I think it's so important, everything that Jim just said, that report will be on the website tomorrow for everybody to see. Last time I was before you when we did the presentation in December, I spent time talking to you about the basics of pilots and the redevelopment process and what's going on. Just as a reminder, we'll talk about that for a second in the slide in front of you, and then we'll get into a few new topics that we didn't really fully get into the last time that there's been a lot of questions on. So again, for those of you who may not have seen the presentation last month, and if you want to go back and see it, it is on the town's website. When we reference pilots, what we are talking about are pilots in lieu of taxes. And these generate from state statute, which have been around for a long time, many decades. The current iteration stems from a law known as the Long-Term Tax Exemption Law from 1992, and it's widely used across the state. And there is a misconception that these sorts of pilots or tax exemptions were created solely for certain municipalities, larger cities in the state, which is simply not true. The law has never read that way, and they have been used universally by small towns, big towns, suburban towns, rural towns, all over the state, including towns like Westfield and South Orange and Princeton, and towns like that that are not the ones that the misconception that they're reserved for inner cities. Because in reality, what they are a tool that, where appropriate, when there is a need, to partner between a public and a private entity to create a structure in which improvements could not be made without them. And those improvements are not necessarily that a developer can't come in and improve their property, but again, improve it in a way that meets the goals and objectives of the redevelopment plan set forth by the community. And that's what
So Steve, I'm just going to pause you because I do want you to reiterate this point, because there were two letters to the editor that were written this week. One by Joe Salemi, who said pilots are intended to attract developers to projects in dilapidated, depressed, unattractive, risky locations, not in locations that are clearly prime real estate in one of the premier municipalities in the state, meaning Westfield. And then there's another one very similarly written by Bill Fitzpatrick. And he said, a report by this advisory firm, PKF O'Connor Davies, explains that the original use of pilots was to help Newark and Jersey City incentivize companies to stay there during the exodus in the 70s. And that they went on to say that now that affluent suburban communities are abusing the intent and spirit of the pilot legislation to further enrich the developer to the detriment of the municipality. So can you just flat out correct the record on those statements?
Yeah, I would say flat out that those statements are incorrect. There's no evidence in any law that has ever been the authority for tax exemptions in New Jersey that was the intent. There is no longer a need for redevelopment areas to be purely blighted as they used to be, and as is often thrown around still to this day, because the legislature has recognized that there are properties out there that are now maybe not traditionally blighted as we evoke in our minds when we hear that word, but are in need of economic assistance to revitalize and redevelop an area of a town that needs it, that private forces couldn't do without. And again, we're not talking about, and the private forces can't do anything, but they can achieve the goals and objectives of the greater community set forth by the governing body. So I could not disagree more with the statements that you just read, because I see it every day in towns like Westfield all over the state, where projects that like this, that meet the goals and objectives of a redevelopment plan, that qualify as an area in need of redevelopment, that are going to put forth the types of community benefits that the project like this is proposing, with the incentive provided by the pilot program, helps do all the things that Jim talked about, and all the things that we're going to hear from Matt and from Bob talk about later today for the municipality.
And that's consistent with my conversations with mayors all over the state, who said the only way they're getting all these additional residential services and community centers and whatever it may be is through pilots.
Yeah. And Mayor, I think it's worth also adding the comment in the second letter talked about, the enrichment of the developer at the expense of the municipality. And I just want to make something clear here too, because all of this is confusing, and we're trying to, filter all this down into, slides so that we can share all this information. But the $375 million investment number that Jim Gilday mentioned a couple slides ago, that's the investment that's Hudson Bay Streetworks will be making on their property. When we start talking in the rest of this presentation about the pilot payments, that's incremental amounts that the town will receive annually based on a percentage of gross revenues that they'll receive in running those businesses once built. So, there's no situation here with the municipality is, being undermined or, that there's additional burden being put on the taxpayer. These are situations where the taxpayer is capital coming in is going to be diversified by new revenue sources coming in. So, but I
That's
think,
right.
thank you for referencing the letters today, because I think it's important for people to get the facts straight.
That's right.
And just last
one other
question
thing-
on that letter. Steve,
Yes,
I'm
ma'am,
sorry,
I'm
are
sorry.
you familiar with that source, the PKF O'Connor Davies report that is referenced in this letter?
Of course, yeah, it's on their website. It's not, I don't know that it's necessarily a formal report, but it's certainly on their website. And there are several other independent reviews and sources on the benefits of pilots. And you referenced yourself anecdotally, all the conversations you can have with mayors, all the projects that we've seen that the public can look up, because it's all public, where there are pilots in the state. And you can also look up, try to find examples of pilots that have gone wrong, that are regretted by the governing bodies that have imposed on them. And I think you'll find few and far between, and you'll find a whole lot more success stories. One of the things, Councilwoman, you said is the notion that this is a private company getting a benefit at the expense of the taxpayers. Well, there's one fundamental truth here for pilots, and that's the town is in charge of granting them. This is not an automatic. This is not something that a developer is entitled to. It's got to be a partnership. And that partnership requires both sides to get benefits. And the benefits are what we're going to hear about today. Otherwise, there'd be no municipalities to do them. So it's simply not true that it's just a corporate give out.
Thank you.
So I think we can go to the next slide, Jim. So as I mentioned before, there's a couple of topics that we didn't really talk about all too much that have come up in a number of questions. So we thought it important to deal with them. And the first is questions have been raised. Well, what happens if after all of this, Streetworks wants to transfer the project? They want to sell the project, or they want to sell the property. There are protections for that. So we're going to have, it's as proposed here in any redevelopment agreement and a financial agreement. And if you're in town, you're familiar with how we did it at Westfield Crossing, and this is how it's done in other projects as well. You'll have a redevelopment agreement which controls the obligations and responsibilities of the parties as it relates to the construction, the development of the actual project. So that will deal with project schedules. That will deal with what we're looking at here: who can be serving as the redeveloper, and can the redeveloper entity be transferred or sold? It will deal with things like defaults and remedies, we'll talk about in a second. Once the project is built and the pilot kicks in, the separate agreement, a financial agreement, is what's going to control. And in both of those agreements, there are provisions that deal with the transfer of interest in the redeveloper, either an outright sale of the project, an outright sale of the redeveloper entity, or a sale of membership interest in that entity. And those agreements provide protections that provide, as you see here on the screen, with respect to the redevelopment, that the redeveloper cannot do that. They can't outright sell the project or their property during the term of the redevelopment agreement without the written consent of the municipality. And when they sell that, there's also some control in the financial agreement with respect to municipal control over approval of those transfers. One important thing with respect to the redevelopment agreement, law requires that that restriction be reduced to a covenant that runs with the land. And what that means, it's going to be a formal written declaration that gets recorded in the county clerk's office to put on notice all future purchasers, creditors, lien holders, that is a covenant running with the land, that there is no transfer other than as permitted under the redevelopment agreement, unless the consent is provided by the municipality. So we can go to the next slide, Jim. So with respect specifically to this project, we'll have a redevelopment agreement that prohibits those transfers, and will provide the mechanism for how Streetworks, if they wanted to transfer something that was not permitted to be transferred, how they would come to the town to get approval for that transfer. And it will include a requirement that they provide the necessary financial deliverables and other information of the new redeveloper for the town to consider, and decide whether or not to approve or not approve that transfer. And that'll be in existence from the day it's signed, the redevelopment agreement, to the day it's completed, and a certificate of completion is issued for a component of that project. And that would include not just, again, an outright sale, but also a transfer of membership interest above a meaningful percentage. And if they do undertake a transfer that was not permitted in the redevelopment agreement or the financial agreement without our consent, that would be an example of a default. So one of the reasons we have contracts like redevelopment agreements and financial agreements that set forth the terms and obligations of the parties is to also set forth what happens in the event of a breach of one of those obligations or responsibilities. And I know that's a big concern for a lot of people in town. It's, as a lawyer, it's a big concern for us, and it's a big concern for the town, and something that we spend a lot of time talking about, all of these scenarios of things that could go wrong. And you'll hear, just as we did in December, from Matt about the bonds and the special assessments and the redundancies of what ifs that we're building into this project. Well, the same is true at the redevelopment agreement. What happens in the event of a breach? Well, of course, as a good lawyer, I'll have to tell you it depends, but really what that it depends on is where along the process the breach happens. But you will have, the town will have rights at law and equity to be made whole if there's a financial loss. Under the redevelopment agreement, again, that's the construction element of the redevelopment process. It would also include the possibility for termination of the redevelopment agreement and termination of the designation of the redeveloper. And if the default happens, as it relates to any of the projects that are proposed to be developed on the town-owned property that is proposed to be conveyed, we'll also be including a reversionary interest as a remedy in certain circumstances whereby the town can take the property back if that default happens after they were conveyed the property. One important thing also is because of the amount of agreements that are going to be here, it's not just the redevelopment agreement and the financial agreement, but there's the special assessment agreement, there's going to be construction agreements, public financing agreements. All of them will contain reference and incorporation of one another to ensure that a default of one will be a default of others. So there's a unified project here in not just in concept and planning, but also in the legal documents. So I think with that, it's I turn it over to Bob now, Mayor.
Sorry, Bob Powell, I think you're up. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Welcome, everybody. I'm glad to have an opportunity to be with you again. I'm going to focus primarily on a couple of specific issues, some of which have just come up in the last few minutes, which has to do with the general question of why is a pilot necessary. Let me briefly, as I did the last presentation, give you a little bit about my background. I have spent my entire professional career in one way or another in the real estate financial capital markets. After some advanced graduate training in economics and public finance, I headed up the New Jersey Economic Development Authority in Trenton for many years, which is the state's real estate investment bank. From there, I spent several decades as a principal in running a large development company, having to make decisions about where capital could be invested. It was based in New Jersey, and having to do the analysis about where to put your funds and where not to put your funds. For the last 15 years, my company, Nassau Capital Advisors, has provided real estate financial advice to probably 100 public and private clients, mostly public clients, municipalities and state agencies, on all of these various issues of the feasibility of of real estate projects that are being planned and proposed. The pilot issue, in my considerable experience with so many other municipalities, really is a decision-making process that goes right to the heart of the question Steve was talking about a moment ago, and that is a pilot necessary? Many developments go forward in towns all over New Jersey and pay full taxes, and the pilot issue never comes up. What we know from considerable experience now in dealing with pilot and redevelopment projects across New Jersey, especially in suburban communities, is that there are circumstances in which a community wants to engage with a developer to undertake a public-private partnership for downtown redevelopment that will have associated with the project a series of public purpose objectives, not private objectives, not about making money for the developer, but objectives that involve the redevelopment project providing benefits to the public. And that is exactly what leads us back to this analysis that we've done here in Westfield. We typically, in this kind of analysis that we do, put together a very detailed set of worksheets and projections for the proposed project. The question of whether a real estate project is going to give a developer unjust enrichment or unnecessary profits is a matter of financial science. There are standards that the capital markets use all the time to measure what the return on investment and the profitability of a proposed project is. And there are associated standards for what the level of such profitability should be in order to attract investment. If the profit is above that level, it's excessive. If it's below that level, it probably means the project won't be built. What we undertook for Westfield was that kind of detailed financial analysis. It spanned the better part of last year as Streetworks' project was coming together in terms of quantities, product type, the kinds of things they were proposing to build, each of which has its own cost structures, housing, office, retail. We put together, based with our own database, our own analysis of costs, projected rents, the operating costs of the various components of the project, where the money was going to come from. And typically there are two sources of funds for a real estate project. There is equity, which is the good old-fashioned capital that the developers put in of their own. And then there's debt, borrowed money, which also is a very important part of the capital structure. And the final key issue generally that we look at is, over time, what can we expect to happen to rental income and operating costs for that project that will help inform us about the rate of return that the developer is going to get over a reasonable holding period when he puts in this case, around $150 million of equity. That's part of the project cost here, is about $150 million of equity.
Hey, and Bob, only because one of the questions that we received was, is the town investing $150 million in taxes in this project? So just reiterate where that $150 million is coming from.
It's coming from Streetworks and its partners and its parent company. So no, the $375 million in investment in this project by Streetworks that Jim Gilday mentioned a few moments ago, that $375 million is private money, full stop. It's the developer's equity plus a series of development loans that it will undertake and have to borrow with all the covenants and guarantees that go with that potentially. None of that is public money.
And just to follow up on that, and I know this is a question that just came through and regarded, and what about the due diligence that the town and you, our professionals, have done on HBC's financial strength and their ability to bring that equity to the table?
Part of my early involvement in this project, as you know, Mayor, was to have access to the financial statements, not only of Streetworks, but of HBC. And I have reviewed them carefully with my associate, and my conclusion, as I relate it to you and the members of the governing body, is that this team does have the financial strength and the capability and the experience to undertake this project.
And Bob, I'll add to that, along with Nassau Capital Advisors, looking at those financials. Our finance policy committee looked at them. I looked at them. I interviewed, their CFO and all the people involved in their development projects and looked at their track record, attracting co-investment partners to go into them go in alongside of them, if they decided to do that in this case. So, we really gave it on a combined basis, a very thorough investigation.
Right.
And Bob, I know there's also been a number of questions from the public about their ability to review the financial analysis that you did. I'll just go ahead and answer that question before we move on to the next slide. As we get, we work through this process to introduce the financial aspects of the redevelopment to the public. And, we've been, putting information out as we have had a chance to introduce it. So as we get further along in this process, we will make that financial analysis available. And the only other thing that I wanted to add to what Bob said in terms of his thorough review of the type of pro forma financial analysis that was done on this project is that there wasn't just one set of assumptions that were used. When you look at models like this, you're using all, a variety of different assumptions to see what the impacts might be. If, some of the market conditions are rosier, or if we have lower rates of rent up in a residential building or in an office building. And so I think the analysis that Nassau did was extremely robust, and we spent a lot of months and a lot of time taking a look at that financial analysis to be able to reach the conclusions that Bob is sharing with you tonight.
I can just add quickly to that, Councilwoman, that because in real time, as we've been engaged with Westfield over the last 2 years, we have been finishing up several dozen similar analyses of projects in similar communities in northern New Jersey that are now under construction, or have been completed. And we continue to have our own access to those completed costs, those rents, those operating expenses, and we pay very close attention to what other developers are actually incurring. One of the challenges right now in our business is the rapid run-up in construction costs that's occurred over the last 3 years. And now we have rising interest rates. Those factors are not just theoretical. They actually are impacting real projects that are being budgeted today and being bid out today and being built today. And we use that data that we have access to true up what we see in the Westfield project and make sure that the numbers are credible. They don't always have to be exactly the same. All projects are not created equal, but we want to make sure that the materiality of costs, income, expenses are credible. And in this case, I'm confident that the models that we have done achieve that result. In terms of the next step of public disclosure, I'd add one other thing, and that is that there will come a time soon when Streetworks will submit a formal application for a financial agreement, which is the legal term for a pilot. There's a written application that's not yet been submitted that will go to the governing body. It's typically an 80 to 100 page document with multiple exhibits. And one of the exhibits will be the financial model that they have put together, which now that we've been engaged with them for the better part of a year, I'm reasonably confident is going to be very square with the one we have done, because we're on the same page in terms of the pilot formula, the percentages and that sort of thing. The financial application, the application for financial assistance is a public document. So I don't know exactly when that application gets submitted. Steve may know more about that than I do, but that'll be part of the record, I think, before you take official action.
It will be before they take official action. It has to be by law. Yep.
So let me go back to this project. After we completed our research and built the model, we built two models. We typically build two models for these kinds of projects. Model one uses the data that I've listed here with one assumption that's different than the second model. The first model assumes that the project pays full taxes. The second model uses the same cost and rent information, but it assumes that if the full tax model does not give us a return on investment that, in our opinion, is satisfactory, we then run a second model, which introduces a pilot rate of various levels, and we adjust that. The model is an interactive tool that allows us to, in lieu of taxes, put in a pilot burden for operating expenses. The pilot's just another operating cost, just like insurance and maintenance and labor, that lowers your net operating income in an apartment development. So when you introduce a pilot at 10% of annual gross revenues, you get one level of operating cost. If you raise it to 13%, it's a higher rate. And each time you do that, the model will automatically recalculate the rate of return on the developer's investment. That process led us to a couple of conclusions. We first determined, after we ran the model at full taxes, and taking into account the various components of this project that are public improvements, such as the 36 affordable housing units, millions of dollars that are being contributed by the developer towards public improvements, the design criteria that the Westfield planning team has imposed on the buildings here, the quality of the design, the landscaping on the developer's property, the energy efficiency standards that will be imposed in the developer's agreement, all of those conditions that are beyond what a typical zoning ordinance would impose go into the calculations to determine whether at full taxes, all those costs give you a profitable investment. We determined that at full taxes, the project would generate a profit. It would be profitable. The level of profit that we measure in terms of something called the internal rate of return on the investment over a 10-year period, the rate of return was in the roughly 7% range. And all that means from the capital markets point of view is that that's below the level that generally is accepted in the capital markets that is satisfactory for an investor to receive, given the various risks that are involved in this particular project. And there are a number of risks. This project hasn't been built yet. It hasn't been leased yet. There's inflation. There's the possibility that we all read about that there could be some slowdown in the economy in the next 2 or 3 years. Construction costs, while they've stabilized, are not all stable, and inflation and supply chain issues are continuing to burden the construction and the development community. All of those are risks. They're manageable. The top developers know how to do that, but there are some unknowns. And in return for risking over $100 million of equity, the capital markets have generally indicated that you need to expect a return in the double digits. 10% is sort of the minimum. It can go up to 15% depending on your view of the submarket. In this case, when we did the alternative analysis with a pilot and pushed the pilot rate up to what we thought was about the highest levels it could go, starting at 13% and going up to 15%, we looked at a rate of return that's just around 10% on the equity investment. That is, number one, satisfactory, in my opinion. Number two, it's at the low end of returns. And number three, there is no way to characterize that return as enrichment, unjust enrichment to the developer. It's not. It's just not at all based on the math and the financial analysis that we have done. So our recommendation to the governing body has been that there be a pilot, and that we further gave the mayor and council recommendations for the specific pilot rates that would be incorporated in the financial agreement. Many pilots just have one flat rate for 30 years. The minimum rate generally is 10% of annual gross revenues. In this case, we pushed those rates up in the initial year to 13%, and then we're escalating them over the 30-year period up to 15% of annual gross revenues. And on that basis, in my opinion, we still have an investment on the part of the developer that is financially feasible. But I will tell you, and I've told the mayor and the council, that this is not unjust enrichment. It's not excessive. It's a reasonable but not outrageous return on investment, given the challenges and the costs that are associated with it. So on that basis, we've concluded that the pilot agreement should have the parameters that we've just described. And if you want to flip to the next slide, I'll mention this. These are part of the public improvements that the project is going to be providing to the town, beyond just building some new buildings in town, that pull down the rate of return on investment, therefore creating in part the need for the pilot. So let's flip to the next slide. We covered that at full taxes. The project generates a return in the mid-single digits. And with the pilot agreement, we were getting a pilot in the 10% range, which, as I said, I think is sufficient to justify the investment.
And Bob, there's some questions about your last line here about the full taxes. If you could just kind of elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, so at the beginning of the financial agreement, the pilot payments will represent approximately 70% of what full taxes theoretically would have been during that early years. And then as the pilot rate escalates, the percentage of taxes escalates accordingly until it's a little over 80% in the last part of the financial agreement. I guess Steve might have said, but I should mention it again. At the end of the 30 years, what happens? What happens is that the project goes back on the tax rolls and pays full taxes. So that's.
I also think, there's this question that I just want to, you said it, but I want you to reiterate, where people say, well, how much are they saving on taxes? But I think you have the whole point about what you just took us through is the project wouldn't be built without the pilot. So
No.
you can't, it's a kind of a hypothetical, not realistic question to have, because there is no comparison, because it wouldn't happen otherwise. Is that accurate?
That's exactly right.
Statement?
And there's another standard here. It's not just my own professional standard about what is doable here. This is something called an inclusionary project, which means that it's intended to include affordable housing under the Mount Laurel decision to satisfy part of the town's obligation. The Supreme Court has long ago set a standard, a financial standard, for inclusionary projects. It will reject inclusionary the courts will reject an inclusionary project if an objector says the project does not create a realistic financial opportunity to build the affordable units. That's a term from the Supreme Court decision, a realistic financial opportunity. That phrase has triggered a widespread amount of analysis of inclusionary projects of exactly the kind that we've just discussed here that we've done on yours. And my conclusion, as you suggested, is that at full taxes, the project won't be built because it's not sufficiently profitable, and therefore there's not a realistic financial opportunity that these 36 affordable housing units will be built. That'll create a double problem for Westfield because those units sooner or later are going to have to be built somehow. So yeah, I think the point that you're making, which I can highlight again here, is that in my opinion, based on the analysis that we have done, if the project doesn't get the pilot that we're talking about and it's forced to pay full taxes, in my opinion, it's not financially feasible, and I don't think it will be built. Here is a summary. We tried to keep this kind of simple because the worksheet got very long, but we took a snapshot of several years of the 30-year pilot agreement that's going to apply to the various zones that were described earlier by the Streetworks folks, the west zone, the north, and the south zone. And this indicates in each of these years our projection based on the schedule of development, the schedule of lease up and completion and stabilization of the various private components, our projection for what the pilot revenues will be to Westfield. So in 2027, which is a really early stage of the project, not a lot has gotten built at that point. We expect that there to be roughly $495,000 of pilot revenue. As you go down in 5-year intervals, by 2032, we project that the project will be fully built out and stabilized, and will be generating around $5 million of pilot revenue to Westfield. As you go down further 5-year intervals, we're assuming, I think our assumption was roughly a 2% increase in annual rents that will bump the annual gross revenues by 2%. That causes the pilot revenues to gradually ramp up over that period of time. The 2% increase, by the way, just historically is rather conservative. In the last 3 years, apartment rents in northern New Jersey, the rents have gone up roughly 14% a year. Even during the pandemic, there was a slight dip, but that didn't last long. There's an acute shortage of rental housing in New Jersey, and that has resulted in a rather robust increase in rents for almost all the projects. We've been conservative in assuming a 2%. So that's why you get this growth in pilot revenues, so that over 30 years, when all of you will be around, there will be roughly $213 million of total pilot revenue generated by the financial agreement. And I think that may conclude my presentation. I'm not sure, is there another slide?
Hey, Bob, yeah, can you just clarify one other thing too? And I think this is about going back to the pilot, and about the fact that Streetworks will still pay conventional taxes on the land, and
Yes.
then also be paying conventional taxes on the land that they purchase. So they, which is something that is currently even not on the tax rolls. So when people, concerned about the immediate impact on, current revenue, it's land value still gets taxed conventionally, and we're adding land value to the tax rolls.
That's right. That's exactly right. And right now, the two parcels that they would purchase are, on the north and south zone are tax exempt.
Correct, exactly. So there's new property coming on to the tax rolls,
Yeah.
which they'll pay land value on conventionally, and the pilot's only on the improvement.
Well, by way of reference, if you just look at the west zone pilot revenue column here, the very first column, in the first year, that's about what the property's paying now in real estate taxes in its current form. But once the improvements come online, you see a literally a 5-fold increase in revenue from the west side, from 450,000 up to 2.8, which obviously is a very dramatic increase to the town. And that doesn't include the additional revenues that are going to come online in the north and the south properties as those improvements come on stream in 2030.
Got it.
Anyways, Matt's
Thank
turn.
you. Yeah.
All right, well, good evening, everyone. Going last and running low on time, so I'll try and be quick here. This first slide actually is a little exciting. I get to play planner for a minute, and so I guess if I say anything wrong, it's clearly Chris Colley's fault, the town redevelopment planner. This map shows an overview of the total development project. In the top picture, the areas that are in color are project areas, and the grayed out areas are not part of the project. With respect to the private development, we've heard a lot tonight about the private development, what Streetworks is building, how much it's going to cost, what their investment is, et cetera. That's all taking place on the red lots, right? That's where they're going to build, pay hundreds of millions of dollars of their money to develop the rental units, the townhomes, the office, the retail, all the things that I'm sure you're all familiar with at this point. And as I think was covered earlier, the town doesn't pay any of those costs. The $54 million in public improvements that we'll get into in greater detail in a minute, they're all being constructed on the lots in blue and are being paid for from the revenues produced by the private redevelopment project. So revenues from the red lots pay for the public improvements in the blue lots. So you've seen this slide before if you were at the last Facebook Live. This is a higher level summary of the public improvements that are being funded by the project. $54.2 million. If you're looking for a more detailed description of what exactly these improvements are, where they're located, I think the prior slide deck from the first Facebook Live we did went through all that in greater detail. So I encourage you to go take a look at that. For tonight, what we really wanted to do was drill down on these public improvements, the who, what, when, where, why, and how of these public improvements. So here you can see a more detailed list. This is half of it. We'll get to the other half in a second. It's really the list of the public improvements, along with estimated costs of each of those improvements. So over these next two slides, you can see all the improvements. You can see their costs. Importantly, many of these costs have already been, and the remainder of these costs are undergoing review and validation by the town's independent consultants. So like every aspect of this project, really, traffic, public improvements, project revenue, you just heard from Bob Powell on that, everything is validated by the town independently. Yeah. What you see in total is that the cost of the improvements add up to about 54.2, almost $54.3 million. So in connection with public improvements, we've also been asked some great questions about the detailed cost, what's included and what's not. So the $54 million amount includes all the hard costs. It includes all the soft costs. It includes a 10% contingency on the hard costs. And importantly, a 10% cost escalator. That's in the budget because the reality is these improvements aren't being constructed today. It's very likely, if not a certainty, that some of these improvements will cost more money by virtue of the fact that we're paying for them or they're being constructed 3 years from now, for example. And so that cost increase is factored in. Performance and payment bonds are also included. These are the bonds that ensure the public improvements are completed and that the contractors doing the work are getting paid. And Jim can correct me if I'm wrong, but most construction, if not all construction projects that the town undertakes in the ordinary course, come with similar performance and payment bonds. So no different than other capital projects. What's not included in that number? The town's going to have its own independent owner's rep to verify the scope of public improvements that are supposed to be built are actually built in accordance with the plans. It's sort of another independent check along with all the others to make sure that the town is getting what it bargained for before we pay for that work. So let's talk a little bit about the sequencing of the public improvements, because this is really important. We spent just a little bit of time on it last time. The town has phased the public improvements in a way that makes sure we're never too far ahead of the redeveloper's work and the resulting revenues that are being used to pay for the public improvements, right? We need the red project to get built so that we can pay the debt service on the blue projects. So if the redeveloper starts and completes one portion of the overall project and then stops for some reason, we basically stop too, right? And we wait to see what happens next. So as we go through the phases, phase one is the north parking garage, associated environmental remediation, and the parking management operation enhancement that goes along with that, and the south garage. This is basically the technology, the app that tells you when spaces are available, et cetera. Phase two, these improvements are really important relative to the parking garage, which is why they're so closely linked. We all know crossing North Avenue at Central can be difficult, and from Elm to the train station. So these are improvements that are necessary basically to safely, effectively, efficiently open the north garage. That's phase two. Phase three, the south garage, the associated environmental remediation again, and similar parking management enhancement costs. Phase four, similar to what we talked about on the north side, as the west zone gets done, it's important that the hardscape and the streetscape and all the road improvements and the traffic mitigation upgrades, the traffic lights, et cetera, that all of that is done so that we don't feel the burden of traffic and pedestrian improvements resulting from the west side being leased up and people occupying. So phase four is those improvements, and you'll hear us in a minute, they're tied back to those west zone projects. And then phase five is the similarly all of the traffic and pedestrian and other improvements that relate to the south parking deck and the south office. Again, we don't want people coming into the south office buildings without having all of these improvements already taken place. Okay, so now we're going to break down these public improvements sort of one at a time. The phase one public improvements, again, are the north garage and the related improvements. All of these are sequenced linearly, right? So construction of the north parking deck and issuance of the bonds to fund that commences after the redeveloper has gotten all of their approvals for their Lord and Taylor office project, all the approvals for their Lord and Taylor first residential building, and for the north parking garage. They have all of their construction and equity, so they've got 100% of the capital stack funds needed to build those projects. They're in the ground with footings and foundations. They've at that point spent millions and millions of dollars on hard and soft costs of construction, and they've contributed $8 million to the town for public improvements, which we're going to come back to. So the point here is we don't start until we see that they are sufficiently underway. That north parking garage takes 12 to 18 months to complete. Cost about $17.8 million. You're going to see that that number doesn't exactly line up to the bonds that fund it. I will come back to that, but it is funded from bond issue number one. So again, the phase two public improvements are all of the public improvements necessary to really effectively open and utilize the parking deck. So really important here that these improvements are required to be completed by the time the north parking garage opens. So that's going to dictate commencement of construction. Again, it's all sort of linear and based off when the west zone gets underway. It'll take 6 to 12 months to build these improvements. They cost about $9.5 million. And it's funded from the $8 million in the redeveloper contribution I mentioned just a minute ago that we get when we issue the bonds for the north parking garage, plus $1.5 million that Streetworks is additionally going to advance over and above and ultimately get repaid down the road. So the south parking garage, again, construction is going to commence within a time period of their starting and being in the ground on the first south office building. What does that mean? It means, again, they've gotten all their government approvals for that office building and for the south parking garage. They've secured all of their financing necessary to construct the south office building. They've got tenants for at least 50%, if not more, of the first office building. I would suggest that maybe they may need more just to get the financing. So one may solve the other. They're going to be near completion of the Lord and Taylor office and residential at that point, and they'll likely have commenced construction on the north townhomes. And again, they've invested $9.5 million at this point into the public improvements, the $8 million that they don't get back, and the $1.5 million that they may get back down the road. So again, we see what we collectively on behalf of the town view as significant progress towards completion by the time we act on the next public improvement. Again, south parking garage, similarly, 12 to 18 months to complete, costs about $13.5 million, and will come from a second bond issue.
Matt, maybe we should just pause for 1 second, because it's a lot of information we're talking about in these phases, and just reiterate the fact that the reason that we're sequencing this is, one, because you can't construct all this stuff all at the same time, but also because at each point that we're starting a new public improvement, we want to make sure that there's that we have confidence that the pilot revenues coming in are going to be sufficient to cover the financing costs, the principal and interest payments that will be due over time. So, and what I want to reiterate here, because I've gotten a lot of questions since the last call, is that none of these public improvements are being funded by the residential taxpayers. These public improvements are being funded by the new incremental stream of pilot revenues that are coming into the town as a result of this redevelopment project. And we have structured this transaction and phased it, as Matt's going through, to ensure that the monies that are coming in are going to cover the costs that the town will incur. So I just wanted to take a moment to emphasize that to everyone.
Yeah, and Councilwoman, those are great points. Again, I keep using the word linear because that's what it is. It might be frustrating that we're not just talking about, in June of this year, this is what happens, but that's done intentionally, right? And it's done as an intentional and significant protection to the town. Things have to go in a certain order and have to occur before we take a next step. And you can, in my view, you can really see by virtue of the phasing, you can go through an analysis and say, well, what happens if they stop here? What happens if they stop here? You can see where we stop and what we haven't done and bond obligations we haven't issued because that revenue is not coming along. And what happens from there obviously depends on the reason for the stop. Steve touched on some of those things earlier, but it is intentionally linear and fed off of conditions precedent in order to protect the town and keep us in a position of being able to pause if we need to, because the development has paused for some reason.
Right, exactly. And I'm just going to emphasize that, Matt, because these are protections to the town, the sequencing and the information that we'll get and the decisions that we'll make along the way. These are protections on top of the redevelopment agreement protections that we already have. So there's a lot of risk mitigation going on here in the way this whole deal is coming together.
Yep, agreed. And thank you for the pause, because it is a lot of sequencing within the public.
Yes, sure.
So picking back up, the phase 4 public improvements, which again are west traffic, streetscape, etc. Again, these are really important to be done, as I mentioned earlier, prior to the west zone getting done. So that's exactly when they get started, right? They need to be completed before the Lord and Taylor office and the Lord and Taylor residential opens. Put another way, the developer can't open and start leasing the office and the residential until these things are done, right? One is a condition of the other. So again, we are ensured that A, the revenue is there, and B, the benefits that these improvements bring to everybody who lives or works in town will be there. So they take about 6 to 12 months to complete. They cost about $5.3 million in the aggregate. And these are funded by primarily and mostly by 50% of the town's land sale proceeds, which get reinvested into the project. That doesn't cover all of it. So the bond issue number 3 takes care of the rest of it. Now, there is a circumstance, if we can just go back, Jim, real quick, there is a circumstance as we talk about phasing where this work may need to be completed before we have sold the town land, right? Because of the triggers we talked about a minute ago with the office. If that office takes longer to start, these improvements can't be paid for initially by those land sale proceeds. So if that circumstance occurs, no worries, we still are going to get those improvements done before the Lord & Taylor sites start opening, because the developer will have to invest that money in, and then ultimately can get taken out from those land sale proceeds. And then last one, phase 5 public improvements, again, primarily the south zone improvements together with Quimby, which we heard about earlier. The underpass upgrades and the pedestrian walkway that I think Streetworks talked about. Once again, these need to be completed prior to the first South Office building. So critically important that, you know, one can't happen without the other. And that goes for the south improvements. I should be more specific. The Quimby underpass and pedestrian are tied to the second South Office building. But the first South Office building, the time when we're generating trip generation, people on the street, et cetera, all the South Street and Town Green improvements need to be done. Those take 12 months to complete, all of them. They cost approximately $8 million, and they're also funded through the last bond issue. Okay, so.
And I'll just interject, Matt, and say, you know, all of that phasing has been studied very, very carefully in a very intricate color-coded Gantt chart that, you know, make sure that, you know, we, you know, understand over time, you know, when these things will sequence in, and, you know, how those monies line up, and, you know, all those things to make sure that it's all sequencing together.
Yeah,
it's a little bit hard to see in slides. And that's why, you know, even you all and we are looking at, you know, these Gantt charts to make sure that we understand how these things are going to come together.
That's right. And importantly, that construction schedule is going to end up being a part of that redevelopment agreement, right? It's not like the developer has the opportunity to just, if they never start the first, we never get anywhere, and it just sort of, we all sit in a vacuum forever. The redevelopment agreement will have a construction time schedule that covers all of this. And so there will be an obligation to get started. I mean, there are choke points, there are default points, et cetera, throughout the whole process to ensure that we are moving along this sort of linear process.
Right.
So the last 5 slides sort of focused more on the phasing of the public improvements and referenced where they're being funded. We thought it'd be helpful to sort of show basically the total sources of funds to fund those $54.2 million. So we talked about a bond issue number 1 that funds the north parking garage improvements. We've talked about the redeveloper contribution that comes in at issuance of those north garage bonds. So we have that money in hand early, so that we're not relying on the developer down the road to give us that money to make those north improvements, which are critically important. Another risk mitigation factor. Bond issue number 2 on the slides is what we call the south parking garage bonds. There's that third bond issue for the remainder. And then again, investment of about half of the town land sale proceeds. The town, of course, selling land at a market rate confirmed by an independent appraiser. Again, more third-party confirmation. Half of that money being reinvested, the other half being immediately available to the town. So add up all those sources, and we're at $54.2 million in public improvements. So similarly, we talked about the funding sources. There's 3 bond issues. Here's a summary of what they are and how they operate. So bond issue number 1 is the north parking garage and related improvements to phase 1. We see here $20.1 million of bonds. Now, if we go back, which we don't have to, Jim, but if we go back, we see that those improvements cost approximately $17.8 million. So why is there a difference? This bond issue is also funding capitalized interest. What is that? Why are we raising it? It's important to know. Capitalized interest is basically bond proceeds raised and used to fund interest on that bond issue for a fixed period of time. It's very common in revenue-based capital projects. If you have a project that's going to produce revenue once complete, and that revenue is meant to be used to pay debt service on the bonds, you're going to have a gap where you issue the bonds, you're paying debt service during construction, and you don't have revenue because that project's not complete. That's really the case here, right? We have bonds being issued to fund the north parking deck. The debt service is going to be paid from the west zone, but the west zone revenues will trail the debt service due on that one series of bonds. So the capitalized interest covers this. And if there's still a gap after the capitalized interest is all used up, which is a very fair question, I'm sure several people just asked themselves that question. That's where the special assessment that we spent a lot of time on last time comes into play, right? A lien on the west zone property in the event that the developer doesn't make a special assessment to cover our debt service shortfall. And that's obviously really important.
Yeah, a huge risk mitigant that we were able to negotiate with the developer.
Correct. So in addition to capitalized interest on the first bond issue, all three bond issues include the cost to issue the bonds, right? We have to pay a rating agency for our AAA rating. We have to prepare a preliminary and final official statement, which is the offering document investors use to make an investment decision, other professional costs, et cetera. So all of those costs of issuance are included in these numbers as well. Bond issue number 2 funds the phase 3 improvements. There's no capitalized interest here because the bonds are being issued much closer to when those west zone revenues start coming in. And again, the special assessment always applies at issue. Bond issue number 3 funds basically phase 5, plus the couple reimbursements that I mentioned earlier that where Streetworks may have to advance funds. Again, no capitalized interest. So we add all those up, we're looking at about $43.7 million. We talked last time about debt service being at about $3 million based on a 4% interest rate. All of these projections have been modeled on a 4% interest rate. To give a sense of order of magnitude of that interest rate, a comparable municipality, Village of Ridgewood, who is also AAA, sold 25-year bonds, which is what all of these are, $30 million worth, so not too far from any one of these bond issues, and received a 3.16% true interest cost. So a significant reduction in interest from what we are modeling. Order of magnitude, that's like $6+ million in excess pilot revenue to the municipality. So I know some people have asked questions, is this a great time to issue bonds? I know rates are up. It's important to note, mortgage rates are up, auto loan rates are up, and yes, short-term municipal tax exempt rates are up significantly, but long-term municipal tax exempt rates, while up a little, are not sort of pacing in that same increase period. So understandable, completely understandable for people to be concerned about that, because all we hear about is rates are up. But municipal bond rates, tax exempt municipal bond rates are holding pretty strong. Not only was that a great rate, there were 9 different institutions that wanted to buy at that rate or something within 10 basis points. So that really goes to show you that that is where the market is. So still a significant amount of cushion in these projections. So I know we showed this slide during the first Facebook Live, and we're showing it again because it really goes to some of the questions that we've all been getting, and I think the mayor and councilwoman have raised. How much excess town revenue will there be? Is that going to be used for tax reduction, town projects, school projects? When does that happen? And this chart is meant to graphically give an illustration beginning in 2030, as we said earlier, sort of when the project is stabilized, when all of it is built, all of it is occupied, all of it has been running for a full year. That's what we mean when we talk about project stabilization. Once we get there, we've got debt service of about $2.95 million, obviously a lot less if we can get that 3.16 interest rate. and you see the orange line going up. The difference between those two lines is the excess revenue to the municipality that the governing body year over year can choose to allocate, reserve, spend on projects, etc.
Right. And I'll just repeat it again. The Matt, if you go back to that last slide, the graph, this, as you take a look at this, understand that that there's a bond debt service line there, but that debt service is not being borne by the residential taxpayer. It is being covered by this this new stream of pilot revenues coming in, plus. So all that excess between the orange and blue lines is just incremental monies that the town will receive as a result of this redevelopment agreement after the costs are covered.
Yes, that is a great point. The orange line is obviously over and above the amount, right? You go back to the slide Bob Powell talked about, which again, we don't have to do, but in the 2030 timeframe, maybe it started at 2032, you're looking at $4.5 million plus of total pilot revenue against, again, about $2.95 million, just less than $3 million of pilot revenue. So you have an excess of $1.6 million right off the bat, and then that number grows because debt service stays the same, right? We are issuing, all three bond issues will be issued with level debt service. So the total of those three issues, again, it's about $2.95 million. That will increase or decrease by literally $1,000 here, $1,000 there. But generally, once all three bond issues are issued, it's within $1,000 or $2,000. It's $2.9+ million a year. So that line is not literally perfectly flat. It's meant to sort of illustrate that debt service does not change. So once we're getting more than $3 million in pilot revenue, which we're getting earlier than this, any pilot revenue dollars over and above that through the increase in the pilot from 13% to 14, 14% to 15, rents going up, not even the way Bob described them going up, etc. This shows that. And I think it also shows fairly what happens if, rents don't go up as quickly, right? Or, there is a little bit of vacancy or a lot of vacancy, quite frankly, at the office or somewhere else. It shows you the significant amount of cushion over time that you have to offset those type of risk mitigations.
And Matt, and I don't know if this is for Matt or Bob, but someone wrote, Kevin Fitzpatrick wrote about the pilot schedule. He said the schedule clearly illustrates that the pilot revenues are heavily backloaded to the later years, have less value on a net present value basis today, and are more at risk through the uncertainty of long-term forecasting. Wow, he said. So what are your comments on that, either one of you?
I think the pilot revenues reflect a general understanding of the strength of the Westfield real estate market. We are not escalating. I told you earlier, I said we're assuming a 2% annual increase, which one might even say does not keep track with inflation, depending on what happens going forward. The view that I think is generally accepted among real estate professionals is that high quality locations like downtown Westfield with this level of quality improvements is going to enjoy at least modest year-over-year increases in rental income in these properties because of the limited supply and the attractiveness of the downtown.
But I assume, let me ask you, I assume when they said heavily backloaded the later years, that it's reflective of the 13, 14, 15% escalators.
Correct.
Which is a common, actually, we have I think probably a more aggressive pilot structure than many, but that's a very common mechanism, right? In order to let the project actually stabilize.
Well, let me make another observation about the numbers that I think at least are comforting to me independently. in the first few years of the pilot projections, looking at this graph that's on the screen here, for every $1 million of debt service that is going to have to be paid, you're going to get $1.5 million of pilot revenue, a 1.5 times coverage at the very early years there. As you go further out, every 5-10 years, that debt service coverage for every $1 million of debt service, which doesn't go up, by the way, you're going to see 2 million of pilot revenue, 2.5 million, and 3 million. So the coverage at the beginning is, I think, comfortable, and it only gets better as time goes on. There probably will be in the next 30 years another recession or two in the real estate business. History has shown us that those recessions can short-term reduce the growth in rents, increase vacancies in office and residential properties. But even the recession of 2008, as severe as that was, had an impact on markets for about 3 years, 3.5 years. And especially in the high quality locations where supplies are very limited and the barriers to entry are very high, which describes not only Westfield, but Morris County, New Jersey. The rebound is rather quick. And given the fact that we have rather comfortable coverage of this debt service at the very beginning, I think that the risk here is very, very minimal.
Thank you. I'm trying to be mindful of time. I'm sorry, Linda, go ahead.
Yeah, I
And
was
then-
just going to say, Mayor, that I think it might be good for Matt to go on to his
That's what I was gonna say,
final
to
slide or
finish.
two,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
those are really an important, encapsulation of a lot of
Great.
information that he covered today.
Yeah.
Thank you. So for whoever's left, this is we got a lot of great questions about performance of and cost management of the public improvements. So the redeveloper is going to complete the public improvements, and as I mentioned earlier, the town's going to have performance and payment bonds, and we hold all the funds to complete the improvements. Right? We went through the source of funds. We hold them all. The developer has to perform the work and requisition that money from us. So again, a safety check for us on getting improvements done. The work itself will be completed via guaranteed maximum price contracts. And the town is contractually involved in that contracting process. So to the question of how do we protect against cost overruns, we use a GMP. Now, if the town post-contract award says, we really want to change the design of the North Town Square, for example, it's basically a town change order, well, then that's going to be on us, right? Because we are fundamentally changing what we had contracted for. That's a town-driven change. But if there are cost overruns just resulting from the project, those are on the redeveloper, if not protected by the GMP. Now, some people out in the construction business know that in a post-COVID supply chain world, there are some things that are going to be passed through costs that could increase the price, even under a GMP. We understand that too, and we've accounted for that in the budget. And we have a further protection through the pilot sufficiency test that we talked about last time that essentially limits the town's cap on how many of these and what amount of these improvements that it can actually undertake. So we use a GMP, the onus is on the developer, and we have our adequate protections. And then this slide, which might be the last slide, is a repeat of what we discussed last time, but I think as the mayor and councilman just mentioned, we thought it was pretty important to just run through again. You heard me talk earlier about the special assessment on Streetworks land during construction and for 3 years following project stabilization. Again, project stabilization after the whole thing is built, after it is fully occupied and we're collecting revenue for a full year, which as Bob mentioned earlier is 2030. For 3 years after that, we continue to have the benefit of that special assessment until they show us that they are revenues are more than 115% of debt service for 3 consecutive years. If that gets broken, then we start all over again and they stay. So if that orange line doesn't go up the way it's supposed to, then essentially that special assessment sticks around. And the assessment is important because, again, it's a first priority lien on the land in the event of a failure to pay. And they have to make the special assessment payment to cover debt service during that ramp up and through that 3 years following the project stabilization period. So really important. To the extent we issue bonds a little bit on the earlier side, to the extent they fall behind, they're obligated to make the payment. And if they don't, we have a security against their land, which will not make their lender happy, but will allow us to collect that payment.
So Matt, before you go on the next slide on this, and I think it's important because I should have probably talked about it before, but there's a lot of questions on what happens in bankruptcy. And with respect to the pilot, I think this last bullet point is important to show the security in that lien in the event of that during the pilot, right?
Yeah, yep.
The bankruptcy. Yeah.
Right. Yes. And importantly, the pilot, the special assessment, those are obligations that run with the land. So Steve, you talked earlier about transfer provisions and what may happen during, what may happen if somebody else steps in, what may happen if they sell it down the road. That pilot obligation, and if they were to transfer during the special assessment period, that special assessment obligation, those run with the land, right? You know, I sell my house, the person who buys it tomorrow has to pay the same taxes. That concept continues here as well. We are getting the $8 million up front. As we detailed, Streetworks is actually investing additional funds in advance of our issuing bonds in order to cover additional costs in the public improvements that they ultimately get reimbursed. Streetworks pays the $10.1 million purchase price, which again is a market rate price based on a third-party appraised value, which is really important for the town. Project revenues projected to be 3 times debt service, right? We're at $71 million of debt service and nearly $214 million of total revenue. So a significant amount of revenue available to the town for other projects, including risk mitigation. If, as Bob said, things don't go exactly as planned, which absolutely is important. Construction conditions preceding to issuance of each series of bonds. That's again, just that consistent linear approach where we can't get too far ahead. And then Steve, as you just pointed out, why a pilot, why a special assessment, why have the developer own the land versus lease the land? Because there's nothing better than a first lien priority interest over and above any lender on the property or equity investor on the property. And when we have a lien on the property that trumps a lender, the lender figures out really quickly how to get rid of our lien by paying us. And
that was my last slides. And I think, Mayor, now we go to a wrap up.
I think,
next step.
yes. And you know what? It is almost 2.5 hours in. I think you covered a lot of the questions. There's, I think, some that came in. I just want to be very clear about, you know, we want to recap. This is the taxpayer and town benefits from pilot revenues. And I think some people, I know in particular, have said, well, if you're using, you know, $73 million to service debt and do public improvement, that doesn't really count as a pilot, when that absolutely couldn't be further from the truth, because it is that $213 million in pilot revenue that's able to enable us to service the debt for those public improvements, or they wouldn't happen otherwise. So they absolutely should be included. So it's $365 million private investment by Streetworks, $213 million in private revenue, and of which 52 will be funding this public improvements, not taxpayers. It's really important to note, taxpayers aren't funding any of this. The $140 million in balance of pilot revenues in excess of the debt service payments, that's what's left. That's the gravy to the town that gives the governing body the discretion to determine how that should best be utilized to bring benefits to the community. And I mean, what a luxury to be able to even to do that, which is something could never happen in in absence of something transformational like this. It could enable us to lower property taxes, enhance school, help with school capital projects, new park improvements. This is how we fund the new firehouse. And also built in into all of that is enough risk mitigation. So some of these, assumptions, or there's unforeseen circumstances happen, that we have enough cushion, as you've heard our experts say, to be able to be comfortably weather any future unforeseen storm. And just to reiterate, no reliance on residential taxpayers to fund any aspects of this project. And I've heard when people, come into the preview center or send me emails, what's it going to do my property taxes? This is the best avenue to make Westfield more affordable for many by having a long-term tax mitigation strategy in place. And that is exactly what this $213 million in private pilot revenue will do for the town. And very importantly, and why we began this in the first place, this will drive an economic infusion into our downtown business. And as where we started with Jim, an opportunity to diversify our tax base so that we're less reliant on residential taxpayers to deliver the services we want, need, and deserve. So I would encourage all of you. This presentation will be up on the website. This is being recorded. It will also be up on the website. For those that haven't seen it, you do not need to have Facebook to watch the replay on the town website. Again, another Facebook council meeting is on Tuesday. A Facebook Live is following on Thursday. Please submit questions in advance. And I'll just say this, we could go on and on and on for hours and hours and days and weeks, quite frankly, answering every single detail. But what we also want to do is to show you the level of sophistication and expertise that we have working on this project. And as elected officials, we are advocates for the town and the taxpayer, and are taking a very long-term vision for Westfield. So we'll do our best to answer everything that we can, but we are really confident in the experts that we do have, and feel really great about the level of detail and diligence that have gone into this process. So with that, I don't know, Councilman Hapgood, if you have anything to add.
I don't, Mayor. I think there will be plenty of opportunities for us to reiterate a lot of the information that's been shared tonight. It's been a lot. I thank all of you for your patience and, sitting through the first session and now 2.5 hours of a second session. The recordings will be on the website. The presentation deck itself will be on the website. So anyone, if you run into people who haven't had a chance to tune in tonight, all the information will be stored there so that you can go back and take a look at it.
So thank you all for spending your evening with us, and thank you to all of our folks who have joined us here this evening. Really appreciate you taking the time. So stay well, everybody. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you all.